Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy Dupuy. I have a PhD in learning disabilities. I do diagnostic assessments, a little bit of intervention, and advocacy for families who've done an evaluation with me. I'm also an adult with both dyslexia and dysgraphia. And so, what I thought we would do today is spend a little bit of time talking about how standardized testing works and how the various scores that you, as a parent or an educator, may see based on an assessment completed of a child. Okay, so let's first start by talking about how test companies actually go out and create the tests. So, a clinician like myself might come up with an idea. For example, I might, if I were going to create something random, say I want to create a test of how well students use a ruler. Overly simplistic, but it gives you a basic idea. So then I would make a proposal to the Test Publishing Corporation, and they would say, Cindy, we think that's a great idea, or Cindy, that's not a very good idea. And no, no, thank you. But the test publisher, they come back in and say, yes, let's do it. So what we would do then is we would begin by stating what age group the test was actually designed for. So tests can go as young as literally infants, and we can go up to 100 years old. So we can test a huge range of age in a variety of areas. So let's say we decided that this test of rulers was going to be for kids as young as 5 and young adults as old as 21. We would then go and pull up the census data, and we would say, looks like we need this many students at this age range from across the United States. And they actually quadrant out the United States. So they've got Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, et cetera, et cetera. And we would target how many of a particular socioeconomic background, how much money do the parents earn, parent education level, did they complete high school, did they complete college, do they have a graduate degree, and ethnicity. Are they African American? Are they Latino? What demographic do they fall in? So we would go out, or they would go out and find clinicians like myself and say, hey, we're looking for individuals of this particular age, of these characteristics. Can you locate and administer this test to people? So as a clinician, I would then find those people, have them do the test where I would administer it, collect how many items they got correct, which items they missed, and then send it back to the test publisher. The test publisher would then go in and norm the data. Now, if any of you ever took a class in which the teacher said they were going to curve the grade, meaning that not everybody scored 100, and people didn't score particularly low, and the data clumps in a weird way, they would actually put it on a bell curve. And the test publishers do something very similar. So they go in and they collect the data and they say, we're going to put it on the bell curve. Now, when they do that, what they're trying to do is identify a particular band of age for a student that is appropriately sensitive. So when we have very young kids, you might have norms, and I said we were going to do 5-year-olds, for 5-year-olds, but 5-year-olds might change their ability to respond, like the number of items they get correctly, very quickly. So we might have a relatively small age range. So we might have 5 years old, 0 months, to 5 years old, 3 months. That is one of our age bands. As we get older, the students' scores are not necessarily as sensitive to their age. So when we have older students, I might say, if we're going to do 12 years, 0 months to 12 years, 6 months. And with older students, I might say 15 years to when they're 15 years 11 months and 30 days old, which would just be 15 years old. And then even older students, we might actually have a larger age band, which is like 17 years to 18 years. Okay. So they determine how the data should be looked at based on the student's age and the sensitivity of how much that individual changes when they are that particular age. Okay. Now there's two kinds of scores that most standardized tests use. And I say most, there are some other scores out there, but we're going to keep it nice and simple. For most of the academic or intellectual IQ tests that we use, they tend to use what's called a standard score and a scaled score. So let's talk about the standard score first. So the standard score is on a metric of 100. So an absolute average score will be a standard score of 100. And what that means is the score falls at the 50th percentile. Now, being at the 50th percentile is different than scoring 50% on a test. So if you score 50% on a test, let's say you had questions 1 through 10, that would mean that you only answered 5 of the 10 questions correctly. When you sit at the 50th percentile, it is very different. What they've done then is they've gone out and they have normed and they've said the student who scores down here at the very bottom in that first percentile actually scored roughly a standard score of 60. And the student up here who scores in the 99th percentile has typically scored around 130 or 135. And we'll just call it 130 for now. Actually, we're going to call it 140 just because it makes it visually a little cleaner, if that makes sense. Let me rewrite that in. So what this means in this case is that if we were to go out and take those students, we got 100 students from all over the United States, and we line them up in rank order, and you score at the 50th percentile, that means, and if you can imagine 50 little bodies down here and 50 little bodies up here, when you score at the 50th percentile, you beat 50 kids and 49 kids beat you. Okay. And we want to think of them not in they got 50% of the questions correct, but that their performance relative to their peers was average, was smack average. This is what we expect kids their age to be able to do, and that is what we consider the norm. Okay. Now, they do create bands to begin to describe the scores so that you as a parent have an understanding of what's expected. So you may actually get a report, and your report might say that your student scored a standard score. I'm going to use a different pen and get rid of this one since it's not working very well. So they might have scored a standard score of 90, or they might have scored a standard score of 109, and they would call all of that as falling in the average range. Now, they actually have bands of scores outside of that. We call this one high average. Then we have superior, and we have very superior. Similarly, when we go down, we have low average, we have what we call borderline, and then we have extremely low. Okay. And those descriptors tell myself as a clinician where the score band is, but it's really not so much for me because I 100% understand this metric of 100. It's more to give you as a parent an idea of what that means. And when your student is scoring in the borderline or the extremely low range, man, that's a flag that there's something really affecting their ability to learn. Okay. I have students, just to give this perspective, I have students that score above 140. Don't have a ton of them, but I will run into students that score above that, who will then also score extremely low. I can have that same student who's scoring in the 99th percentile turn around and score in the first percentile on a particular task. And I see this all day, every day in my practice. And that's part of the reason that you're coming to me. What's happening that we have a student that has a skill this high and then potentially has a skill this low? And that's where the nuts and bolts of diagnosis come in. Okay, so when you're thinking about those percentile ranks, which is what most parents will want to go to when they begin to look at the test score, you want to understand that is just giving us that sense of where they're performing relative to their age peers. Now we have a second kind of score. So if this is a standard score, the other metric we use is something called a scaled score. Now, the difference is this metric of 100 is much more precise. It typically has multiple, or it has a metric higher of test items relative to a scaled score. And so it tends to be a more sensitive measure. Now, one thing that they will do is they will take multiple scaled scores, they will average them together, and then they will come up with a standard score, meaning they have more test items that gives us a more sensitive measure of how well a student performed on that task. So let's say your student did an IQ test and they did something called a WISC. You might see a verbal comprehension, which is expressed on that metric of 100. So you might see a score of, let's call it 94. Now, that would be made up of two scale scores. One would be the similarity subtest. So your student could have scored, let's say, an 11 on it, and then a vocab test, and the student might have scored an 8. And when they average those together, that would give you that overall. And I've not looked that up exactly, so don't quote me that that's the conversion. But they would average those together to then give you that standard score of 94 from the multiple scaled scores with the individual subtest. Okay, so just like our standard score mean sitting at the 50th percentile, our scaled score mean also sits at the 50th percentile. Okay, when this metric of 10 goes up and down, it looks a little different. So where with a standard score, you could have a 101 or a 102, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. With the scaled score, you're going to take a much bigger jump. So you will get a scaled score, and let's call it an 11, which would convert to a standard score, and I'm going to erase this so you can see it. That would convert to a standard score of 105. Okay. Similarly, we could have a scaled score of 8 which would be a standard score of 90. Now, there's actually a formula to do the calculation to come up with that. Or if you're a parent and you don't want to learn the math, they make a psychometric conversion table, and it will tell you here, if you score a scaled score of 12, that would then be a standard score of 110, and it would put you in the 75th percentile. That then helps you better understand your individual student's performance. Now, a minute ago, I was talking about being in very superior, high average, etc. And you're going to see different kinds of metrics on the backside because they've not updated these lower scores with our newer descriptions. We no longer talk about mild, moderate, severe, profound. We tend to talk about atypically low. We have a more appropriate description that does not imply competence in a different way. So we've developed slang around some of the terms that are now considered somewhat of a slur or put down, and they've shifted the language around that. Okay. So again, when you go in and look at your student score, you're trying to get a sense of how well did my student do? Now, most clinicians will tell you that if you get an IQ test and you are a typically achieving individual, your IQ test score won't change much over time. I will tell you that I have students who initially might not perform well on an intellectual ability measure, but as we do intervention for them, let's say they have attention deficit and that significantly affects their ability to focus, that IQ score might change over time as we treat the individual's inattention and we teach them better self-monitoring. That IQ score may go up because we're now measuring their ability to function when they're actually focused. We might have an individual who has an auditory processing disorder. As we work to correct that auditory processing disorder, when they're doing measures of oral language, similarities, vocabulary, et cetera, and we've got a lot of oral language measures out there. As we work on that oral language skill, that score may also come up. So in the typical population who would just be doing kind of their normal thing, we don't expect to see as much change in scores as we may see for an individual who's been diagnosed and then gotten some intervention to help with that particular skill set. There are some other scores out there. They're used less frequently, but hopefully this begins to give you a sense of what do these scores mean? Why are they relevant? Why do we keep talking about them? And understanding again that scoring in the 50th percentile doesn't mean that they tanked half the test. Instead, that means that they're falling smack in the average range relative to their age peers, which is a fairly large band, and that they're commensurate, that they're working consistently with what we expect an individual of that age to be doing. Okay, we're going to talk about one other thing very quickly, because this is something that parents frequently ask me for. Now, one last thing is when they do what's called a grade equivalent. So occasionally parents will get back a test score, and the score will look something like your student scored a standard score of 100, which gives you an age equivalent of, let's call it 8 years, 6 months, and then it gives you a grade equivalent of 3rd grade, 6 months. Looks something like that. I hate these. And the reason that I hate both age and grade norms is they're not what you think they mean. So when they're doing the statistical analysis that created our bell curve and they gave us our metrics, when they come in and they do a grade equivalent, they literally come in and say, oh, you're at third grade in the 6th month of the school year, and so that would be considered average. They then norm it out, and they might have a really high grade equivalent of 6th grade, 8th month. That doesn't actually mean that your student is performing on a 6th grade level in the 8th month of the 6th grade school year. All they did was change the metric of how they were measuring that out. It has no actual meaning of how well your student is performing. It is the frequency with which your student scores at that particular rate. Similarly, they might come back in and saying, if you score particularly low, you're at kindergarten and we'll call it 5th month just to be a little different, in academic performance. And it doesn't really mean that your student is in kindergarten. It just means that they normed the metric out differently. I could put in a metric of, running distance. And I could say, hey, your student can run 30 yards in a certain number of seconds. And I'm just randomly making this up. And then I could norm it out the same way and say that this student can run 30 yards in 12 seconds. And this one can run 30 yards in 45 seconds. And it really doesn't mean anything because all they've done is created a new measuring device. And it's not actually telling us anything. And the age equivalents do the same thing. So when you go into test manuals, so when I go in and I purchase a test and I look it up, every test publisher comes in and says, we should not be using age equivalents and we should not be using grade equivalents, if I knew how to spell, because they don't mean anything. But because parents and teachers ask for these things, not knowing that they don't mean anything, they continue to put them down. So when you see those, do not for a minute think that it actually tells you how your student would be performing if they were in the 6th grade. That's not what it means. It's really not useful. It is more confusing in my mind, and parents think that they're understanding how the data works when in reality, it's not telling them anything. All right, with that, look forward to some other videos from us. Please let us know if you would like us to talk about anything. And if you like what we're doing, give us a thumbs up or a like down below. Thanks.